Okay, so I just kind of wanted to get into, hopefully this is just a quick, just kind of defining terms pertaining to democratic socialism and capitalism discussions. Just kind of simply, I suppose, I'm not, I'm just kind of working through a lot of different things as I generally have been lately, and so I might change my mind on these. I'm not saying that this is my final answer. I'm just kind of interacting in the development of conversations going on, and so we're just trying to figure out what each other's talking about. So here's my initial attempt, and then I also am I think I might later work on the PBD discussion in terms of the video where he is introducing his ideas involving this similar discussion, capitalism and communism. I may or may not. I mean, I keep saying that, but there's a variety of topics that are just evolving and developing, and so I'm just kind of keeping the pace with where things are at. So in terms of these discussions so I've been trying to introduce ideas where I'm trying to explain that I'm not entirely against the idea of capitalism, at least in some sense as we evolve humanity. It could be that in the future there's a better way to approach it or define even what that means. But at this stage, I'm at, in terms of the complexities of humanity and not wanting to just be entirely destructive across the planet, there are in the midst of it some benefits of some forms of capitalism, right? But I also think there's areas where capitalism, depending on various different approaches to it, can be really harmful and create societal closures and power struggles and become utilized in perpetual divides. And so there's also room for repair. And so then we get into this discussion on which versions of democratic socialism are people referring to and what approach are they taking. And so this is where we're going to attempt to try to define, or at least begin to talk about what it seems like, I guess. So in some of the other videos, they say stuff like, okay, we're defining our terms, and when they define their terms, when they're speaking against communism or democratic socialism, they're against the idea of abolishing private property. In general, I also am against that idea because, well, anyway, I don't want to get too complicated. This is just going to be simple terms, right? It could be that, as I say, as the standards of better human relations increase as a collective society, we can, shift into other methods and whatnot. But for the time being, in terms of negotiating where we are globally and domestically and whatnot, it seems to be a part of the equation of kind of keeping the ability to kind of acclimate through stuff, right? So anyway, I'm just explaining from the beginning that I'm not against, I'm not trying to entirely destroy capitalism, and I'm not defining a type of communism or socialism as abolishing private property. But along those lines, though, what I tend to think is that, so even though eventually as you build up capital, and there can be other mechanisms that people can kind of put their equations to and suggest that there's benefits of it in practice in relation to human behavior, it does seem like there are some of those aspects of it. So at this point, though, I'm not really talking about the later developments after you kind of get capitalism going. But in and of itself, though, I think certain forms of capitalism, there are corrective measures. It can't just, if it doesn't help correct for the internal kind of like self-governing as to the better attributes of our human nature, then it also can just become an excessive thing. But anyway, I'm not at this point really getting to the later stages of it. I'm talking about the initial stage having to do with private property or questions there. And I think that's how I try to understand the stage of a corrective measure of democratic socialism, having to do with those stages of private property. So it seems that one aspect of private property is this question as to what kind of private property are people making reference to? What type of land being delegated unto like certain criteria is being referenced? How is it obtained? How is it delegated? And then also, how is it enforced? And so what I have in mind when I think of that, when I think about the world system, what I've talked about, if you follow some of my other stuff, is that even if later on capitalism having to do with like a standard of private property can later develop some good attributes to it, under the, like at the ground level of it, what it's built from generally seems to be the conquest narratives, right? So we see this developing now within America and other countries, is that this battle of the preservation of Western development, Westernized civilization, and being anti-communist and pro-capitalism and pro-private property. And the mechanism by which is built into it is what they say Judeo-Christian values, as pertaining to an interpretation of what Judeo-Christian values are relating to Israel and their version of conquest narratives. And then that still has ripple effects all the way down to the conquest narrative pertaining to Israel, which we're seeing now. And so most of the time when you see people preserving this connection to Israel, it's not, in my estimation, really the stage of freedom that we see in Christ or the other message of like Christianity and whatnot. What we see is the conquest narrative. And we see the perpetuation and regenerating of a conquest narrative built into the very way by which people preserve and defend private property and capitalism and feel weaponized against those that have different views. And that's not to say that later on those views cannot be further and further and further weaponized and simply become a means by which they want to destroy and create a counter argument and whatnot. I do tend to think that that can happen and does happen, but it doesn't mean that if either one destroyed one another, that either of them are correct. I feel like the standard of the closure that has become private property in defense of capitalism as a system, and then opposed to a quote-unquote communist that's anti to the ability for that enclosure of private property system and defended through world power. If it destroys it, it doesn't resolve, it doesn't produce the corrective measure either necessarily. So anyway, there's a lot more that can be supposed there, but it doesn't mean that the solution is to just never have any private property. What I'm trying to get to is looking at what are corrective measures where it's not just either or. It's not just a type of communism that tries to be entirely destructive to certain notions or ideas. Usually people define it as being like a communism that's weaponized against like Christian values, but it's Judeo-Christian values and these conquest narratives. And so if we can do a shift, then it is also questioning what does it even mean to have Christian values and freedoms unto the earth? Does it mean to continue this conquest narrative across the earth? And then when it's this uprising of resistance, what's going on there? Anyway, though, that's why I also approach this with religious theory and say it's not true that the message of Jesus meant to perpetuate a conquest narrative across the earth. There was a more liberating free message, and then what is that, etc. But anyway, let's go back just to following it all the way down to the base. And does it need to be a conquest narrative in the way that it has been introduced globally in relation to preservation of laws, standards, and systems and continual warfare, right? So if you're, kind of following along those lines, then What I am generally, so I've talked about this before, and I try to explain that when I'm thinking of democratic socialism in connection to capitalism, and I say I'm seeing it more as a concession. So it's more of an approach where people are introducing ideas within the political apparatus to introduce or integrate other people within the system. It's a portion that helps to integrate those within the system without entirely having to uproot everybody else and destroy it all and create a whole new system, right? So what I mean by that is a democratic socialism or safety net. It's not even really a safety net, because I think we need to get away from the idea that democratic socialism is simply some type of welfare state or, something to that effect. It's more like, as I said, a system that helps to integrate people within the system, within the present system, without having to destroy the entire system. That's why it's more of a concession, a reparative approach for integration into the system. It's not the destruction of private property. It's a type of integration that should evolve over time among certain standards that are helpful and can be preserved, and corrective measures from weaponized or improper versions of capitalism and conquest approaches that seem to perpetuate conquest. The reasoning for this, so if you're saying, okay, so it's not destroying capitalism, it's a type of integration, the reasoning for that is to explain. So I tried to ask this question before when I was, certain discussions online. And so pertaining to the question, how was private property initially introduced? And so various ones, and this is why I think it perpetuates and generates at the very base this hysteria for preservation, and why at the very base of private property in this capitalistic system, when you really get to the root of it, people start talking about just war theory, because the way they've created their system requires that they moralize how they obtained the private property. And so this is where it becomes argued as to conquest, the conquest narrative. They've incorporated the ability for a type of selective private property based on a conquest narrative. And so then when you start talking about that, then it intensifies and reaffirms the conquest narrative. And then that's why we have this continuation all the way down of people trying to justify the conquest narrative. They don't know how to shift out of it. So this is why I also say the democratic socialism approach is a way by which people are trying to bring corrective measure of interpretation into the system, and then allowing negotiations for concessions to integrate people into it without having to destroy it. Because in some ways, groups will say there actually is that it's a concession because there actually is a moral argument for the improper claim or seizure of private property for groups to justify perpetual world conquest narratives. And so the approach I'm talking about, as I said, is a concession to say, coinciding with gradual evolving and integrating other people is a corrective measure of interpretation, along with concessions to allow people to be integrated into forms of corrective measure for capitalism and whatnot. And this is also why, to do this, we have to propose arguments for understanding education and eliminating propagandized versions that are improper claims on seizure of properties. To give an example, so here's what I'm saying. I'm not saying to go and run people out of places or tear apart society. This is why it's important that we have a good political approach that properly integrates people, and that we have a level of stages of understanding and reconciliatory approaches. we can't really have understanding and reconciliatory approaches if people refuse to shift from a conquest narrative of justification to other, really questioning what that even means. So when you're looking, though, at the conquest narrative, even if people will say, history is really messy and a lot of people involved were generations removed, and so they didn't always understand. There's truth to this. This is why history is messy. Other groups that were generations removed didn't always know all of the details of everything, whereas we could still look at history and say, though, there's a lot of factors because other groups expanded, and there was expansion and escape from other systems, powerful systems, because they also didn't have freedom in those systems. And so part of the argument on the other side is that they were seeking more freedom, seeking religious freedom, seeking their own ability for land development and whatnot, because they obviously then, through definition of that claim, needed it. They needed an ability for land development and religious freedom, of which they didn't have. So then to have that as, like the incentive, but then reestablish another system of enclosure through a type of re-emerging conflict, then really then is not, we need to get back to the question of what is freedom then, right? Why re-emerge in these conquests and perpetually divisive systems and whatnot? So it's just acknowledging some of those things that people were kind of put in situations where we have to shift, people shift across the earth looking for freedom, and then we have to integrate systems that will incorporate that for people groups. What you find then is a mixture of, maybe good intent to redevelop, but also an effect on other populations and whatnot. And so, you have stuff like, if you're looking at, well, how did people, because I was asking this question, how did groups then, in terms of settlement and the conquest of lands, and in some cases the seizure of lands, how did they then begin to allocate what would eventually become portions of an ability to have private property and develop and produce capital, right? And so if you look at the land base, and so I was asking, how did people get into that system then and have delegations of land? And so there seems to be different examples, whether it be the Homestead Act or what, I just looked this up very quickly. Other people are have a lot better information on this, so I'm just introducing very basic ideas. So then there's 40 acres and a mule, where different ones were given plots of land and whatnot under the agreement that they kind of check in and make sure they're developing the land still in relation to the government, right? Then there was the head right system, and then the town proprietor system, which I guess was some kind of collective version of allocation to different ones in relation to certain delegations of land and whatnot. And then there were things like subsidized loans, infrastructure investment, corporate grants, farming grants, or the Desert Land Act, or things like that. And so at some level, this is what I was referring to, is not to say that later versions of, once you have some kind of base, can produce the ability to develop more and more, as long as you're in agreement with whatever that collective standard and their interpretation of things are. But if you're on the side of it where you're not in the group that has access to those delegations, and even if you did, you're hesitant to kind of sign into a system that is against your contribution to society or your interpretation of things and whatnot, basically a type of conquest narrative that forces you to adhere to these certain beliefs, and then eventually a need for survival to somewhat be integrated into it, but not yet really represented by it, right? And so that's what I mean in terms of when people talk about the enclosures of this system and whatnot. And then eventually they have arguments when you get farther up that they say, This system provides more success than those, that are not fully accepting of the system. But there's reason for that. There's reason because it's, like in the speech of Martin Luther King Jr., remaining awake through a great revolution, other groups had been undergirded with land grants, farming grants, acreage, and they just had to agree with the government in this like relational dynamic to check in and show that they're developing the land. And so of course over time that can increase, and then you can gain more from that type of relationship and whatnot. And then over time, in and of itself, participating in it is going to solidify for you the interpretation that that's the mode and a preferred form of success in relation to those that don't want to adhere to that or are hesitant to fully agree to it. So then we get into like questions of, are there other ways to still solve for those same benefits, but look at the very base by which undergirded it with other interpretations coinciding with it? Do we have to have those interpretations coinciding with the other factors for the benefit that it seems to suggest, right? So basically, like, does capitalism and the gains of it have to coincide with, at base, a certain belief system of world conquest? So that's where my argument is, I don't think so. I don't think that that's necessary. So this is what I mean when I say I'm looking at a democratic socialism as something by which we'll slowly integrate people into it without having to, be destructive of everybody else, but at the same time making sure at least there's some sense of allowing some type of land base or property or access to resources for other groups as well. So along these lines, so the question also among various ones is, how are you introducing within these modes of, like, within this offer for this political approach, what are you suggesting is going to be used to defend or enforce those beliefs, right? And so what it seems like at some level is, well, at this point with capitalism, there's the law and the government that is supposed to be enforcing the law, right? So it isn't just these ideas that, like with socialism and whatnot, that the law, would only be used within socialism to enforce it, those other arguments. But at some level, some function. So when you think about it, if we're looking back, if we're going into like simple mode in societies, if you're thinking of like the Wild West, right, when it was difficult for the government to actually be in every place to enforce everything, there were people, having to go into some type of combat or defense to preserve their property and whatnot. And so at some level, it is this question, how do you delegate among people groups who gets what at what time, right? So that was my question. And so I think what people are kind of ignoring is that at some point the government did just prefer and assign land to some and not to others. And so if we want to have a corrective measure, then we have to start thinking about that. What's an alternative to that? And so one aspect that seems to function for people without having a conquest narrative to, like a conquest narrative that then rallies people into this perpetual conquest, and then the government serves that perpetual goal or standard. And then to do that, it has ripple effects, in the larger scheme that we're seeing all across the world, if it is this standard of perpetual conflict as under these certain belief systems. But if we were to just look at it, if that weren't the case, but that is the case, we can't ignore it. That is a factor of perpetual conflict and a defense in relation to these certain assets and systems and whatnot. And it really does perpetually put other people at odds, and it misinterprets, in my estimation, it misinterprets what God is like and what God is. And then, all of these other, like, undermining of other beliefs and undermining of other potential opportunities and demonization of various ones, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, if we then get back into what other force then, because that really is a major force that's defending people's claim to private property. Right underneath it, that's what they are usually defending and signaling defense of. And almost every person that defends that mechanism, it follows all the way to the conquest narrative of Israel and the war machine and the other assets and benefits. But that doesn't mean that a weaponized version of communism to get rid of all of it is correct either, right? So what do we do here then? So one aspect of looking at what helps hold different places into an agreement, and this is where it gets into like the democratic socialism as a corrective measure when there's already war and conflict, right? Or when there's various tensions, is a sense where democratic, meaning a group of people represented that can agree among each other, vote and agree among each other, a standard by which they will be able to like delegate certain allocations. And then through the awareness and documenting of those agreements, they all then give witness and understanding as to what defines an ability, like what is recognized in their governing apparatus on behalf of all the people, who owns what's documented in that government, and then the awareness of, or for an ability to come before the governing apparatus and make a claim or what have you. And so basically at some level, the awareness of the people in agreement, knowing, so say like in a small town, there's this like governing apparatus, they have these certain agreements, they vote on it, et cetera, and they work through it. And then that gets documented as to, okay, so-and-so along this plot and these plots and whatever, like they own this certain place. And so there's an awareness of it. There's a paper trail of it. And so then at some level there becomes a buy-in and an incentive for people to protect and defend the agreement in certain regions. And then I think the socialism part and thinking of like shared space and whatnot as another mode of creating this like corrective integration. What I'm thinking along those lines is, so if we are going back to very basics and we're looking at people groups, of course, if we look at people scattered across the earth, there's the stage where people develop among other groups. So they're born, they have a family, and then they have another group. And so there's a way by which they're established in a place where they live and exist, right? So there's people. So it starts out, there's people and then place where they're at. And then the development of shelter and homes. And then the documented or societal documented of place generally. So when people groups were just living from the land, that's generally how they were living. Because it wasn't so crowded and because there was space to kind of move around within certain regions, there was just an awareness of who lives where at what time. Of course, from time to time there could be among barrier like boundaries and whatnot, maybe some conflict and what have you. But at the time there was, when you're thinking of tribes and various ones, there's an awareness of who lives where and what territory. Even in the point of when you document certain indigenous groups across the world or in the Americas, they had reference and names of who, like what people group lives in what place. Like this people group over there, those are the salmon people, or these people over there, So there was a general awareness of groups that live in certain places. So there's people, places, their shelters, their homes, and then the awareness of place. if at some level people could rewind and say, hey, we're going to produce, like other people need to be integrated into locations, let's, allow for some settlement. There are areas where there were settlements that were just integrated and whatnot, but then other conflicts and encroachment and other things occurring, there was other complications, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, without getting into all of the, like really entrenched histories and stuff like that, we can skip forward though, and we know that at some level there becomes like massive displacement in terms of colonization or other efforts or conflict globally, right? Displacement. And so once people endure levels of displacement and then there's constant warfare, we see this now in the world, the constant warfare and conflict, where there's difficulties or obstructions in developing where they're at, where their place of origin. Then with displacement then becomes this difficulty. How do you reintegrate people into society? And so that's what socialism then is a part of. Among the world where people already have their documented place within systems, for those there's this conflict and displacement, there needs to be mechanisms by which they can then become integrated into it. Just like most systems, almost every system likely that has some type of property, it was given to them. Somehow or another, it was allocated to them or it was given to them. And so if there isn't a way for others to be integrated into that system and then work their way through to also be able to do something similar along those lines, to eventually kind of have a stake in the system, then it's, then it creates this constant displacement and whatnot. Or perpetual grown alliances for conflict. Because then if it's not allowed to be integrated in, then it morphs into these like separate conflicts. You even see that in scripture with the divided kingdom. They said when they went before Solomon, when Solomon was warned that his system had reached a height where there was pending division, eventually through his son, when the groups came to him to request some type of integration and at very least the relief of their burden, because if groups don't allow integration and certain ones have a certain point of integration and certain groups don't, then eventually it creates these mechanisms along the lines of to be integrated into this, or to have interaction with the system is either through violence or slavery or types of sex work or things like that. Because those are just the offshoots of what's not a relational system, what's not responsive in relation to the people or the whole census taken of the people. So when the groups came to Solomon and asked for that, his son refused, and so then it broke off. And they even said, like, what stake do we have in the kingdom? And then it says, like, basically, like, let's revolt to your tent, O Israel, and then that was the divided Israel. And so it's this idea of what are those modes of integration, right? And so what I'm thinking about in terms of like socialism, it's just integration. It's modes by which there's integration for those that don't yet have a stake in private property, and modes to get them to that place, while at the same time it could be expected that there could even be over time improvements in what private property and the systems by which, the standard by which that's defined, could even also be refined and evolved. As I said, it doesn't continually have to mean the conquest narratives. It could simply become a function of private property and a better society built onto it, and certain factors that are more and more situated with human development and behavior and whatnot. What I mean by that is if there's already displacement, because we can't all just like go off on on our own somewhere. Even if we try to go off on our own somewhere and develop, the world now, especially in the States, there's certain claims to land and whatnot. And so at some level, once there's displacement on a mass level, and we're looking at systems where some have private property and some are not integrated at all, or there's like different degrees of it, or the costs to get integrated into it are just like morphing and whatnot. It is the question of integration. And so what I was saying along those lines is when you get to that point, or, what I was kind of pondering is when you get to that point, how do you then integrate? You can't really just start. I mean, even if at first in the origins, if they're allocating land to various ones when at a smaller scale, and then a lot grew from there, we can't really do that at this point, right? We can't just say, oh, all these displaced people, we're going to allocate all this private property to them. And so this is why I say socialism approach that's trying to integrate along these lines can be potentially a useful method of integration where you're without giving everybody private property of their own, like private property allocations. And so then it seems that from that stage of integration, the process of this starts off with some type of collective. So the stages of the social integration seems to be some type of collective. And what I mean by that is, so think of an emergency situation with a lot of displaced people. There usually is some kind of shared space, whether it be some kind of shelter system, some type of could be something similar to what they were doing with the town proprietor system for a collective. I didn't look into that too much. Just the title and the quick description sounded interesting. But basically, it seems like since you can't allocate private property to everybody on mass levels that are displaced, there's some kind of collective system put in place somewhere to at least help meet their basic needs, right? And then over time, though, this is where people say, after a while, though, even if people love each other, even if they have their best interest, that you can't, it's not a long-term remedy. You can start off with a level of collective, but if you're following along the lines of human behavior and human development, then there needs to be options for outgrowth options where, maybe there's the children that want to move, start building their assets and whatnot. And so then there needs to be ways of integration along the lines of integration where they can increase those support measures. They can go from a larger collective safety net to then, maybe a smaller scale of options like opportunities for small apartment living, along with education, or abilities for with other families where maybe they can just some kind of living quarters, right? Some kind of living quarters where they can begin to develop their own personalized skills, where they're not spending their time and effort in the maintenance of whatever the collective portion might be. And so then they start refining their individual types of growth. And then eventually through that, they can start being integrated into their own investments of capital and property and whatnot. And so that's, in some sense, what I mean when I'm talking about socialism as an integration and whatnot. And then the democratic approach as being the people with transparency and awareness and understanding and group consensus as to what they'll agree on and hold the knowledge of that agreement, help to enforce the standard of everybody's proper delegations and whatnot. So along these lines, then, it seems to portray that even in the larger scheme, and not just as a corrective measure for improper enclosures of capital or private property and capitalistic gains that perpetuate that divide, but more of a corrective measure of private property and societal gains and whatnot. In the longer term, it seems like a aspect of socialism means it just is making reference to helping bridge the gap between societal transitions through portions of what's the collective or the shared spaces. So collective shared spaces transitional support. So it's not just people say it's like, it's just welfare and whatnot. The reason I think they have that slur is so they can kind of demonize the aspect of societal support, because they get into these ideologies along the lines of capitalistic gains and preservation. And so they try to, there is some truth though to some forms of socialism being excessive welfare, but at some level though, the excesses of welfare are in relation to the excesses of capitalism building these invisible walls. And so then it inflates welfare as keeping up with these, like standards of interaction between human beings and whatnot. So, but if you're looking at, so socialism is in a sense like the shared spaces, collective shared spaces, transitional support to protect growth among like delegated systems. What I mean by that is, along with society, even if there were groups, there are groups that have certain delegations, certain capital and private property. When through the growth stages of development and maturing, or even just transitioning between, whether it be between work or between other factors, it is just these to help encourage evolving and growth. It's just transitional support. As an example, like right now, because I was put in a position where I had to choose between conditions, I am at a time where I may need to get some transitional support so that I can preserve my assets. And it's not because I hadn't done the work to help develop society and negotiate among society, and also being reintegrated into different types of employment, but it's because whether it be like natural forces, other interruptions to the sequence of these negotiations, that it's just prolonged. And so the process of it is prolonged. So there's this in-between stage where it could potentially hinder my ability to preserve the assets by which I rightfully, through my stages of legal integration, had developed and built. And so it helps to preserve the assets that I've obtained legally, and those safety nets help me to not be forced into improper limitations through conquests and pressures, to not be able to live in the stages of growth unto like the truth of growth that I'm developing my life with, if that makes sense. So it helps to prevent people from being trapped in conditions that are not conducive to their growth. It gives people a little bit, it kind of allows a system to have flexibility to support their stages of growth to further working conditions and whatnot. But it also does have safety nets, right? There's things that happen. There's times where, because we don't live in a state, the governing condition is in constant warfare status, because we live on a standard of constant warfare status and constant conquest. So as we're trying to correct that, there's ripple effects where there's seasons of instability and other forces. And so it helps to diffuse, everybody falling into these extremely divisive responses to those conflicts, and it provides safety nets, and it provides ways that people can be integrated so that it could select for, the betterment of life and basic, by meeting basic needs rather than horrific extremes and divides. But it doesn't mean that there can't be corrective measures to all of these things, and that as humanity improves, then we all improve. But anyway, that's just, I guess, an attempt to explain some of, where I seem to be coming from. So I'll just leave it at that for now.